I know you've been learning about the history of Georgia's movement. What I want to do it coming in here as a historian is to provide a little bit more of the context to think about how these movements fit more broadly into their time period. All right, so in 1939, Samuel Seabury spoke at the 100th birthday of Henry George. He observed at the celebration that, quote, although men have not as yet adopted the specific remedies which he proposed, they have nevertheless absorbed much of his philosophy. And that fact has, of itself, enriched the thought of those throughout the world who believe in democracy. Seabury was himself at the forefront of creating a more democratic nation. He had led an investigation into corruption in New York City that had hobbled the city's Tammany Hall political machine. He then picked Fiero LaGuardia as the Fusion Party's candidate for mayor, and then Seabury inaugurated the city's most famous mayor in his own home. Afterwards, Seabury and LaGuardia worked to put the city's subway system under public ownership. When Seabury delivered his speech, a new age of anti democratic sentiment loomed over the room. A day prior, Nazi Germany had invaded Poland. Between 1920 and 1944, about two-thirds of the world's democracies disappeared amid a growing belief that popular representation and individual constitutional rights had encumbered nations, making them weak and ineffectual on the global stage. In Italy, Benito Mussolini promised that, quote, fascism is action, as in fascism can get things done in a way that liberal democracies can't. The idea of individualism had supposedly undermined the collective will, which was best embodied in an unlimited state power. According to Mussolini, quote, liberalism denied the state in the name of the individual. Fascism reasserts the rights of the state as expressing the real essence of the individual. In other words, individuality was best expressed through the collective will of the state. In contrast, Henry George had promised a way to meet communal needs without impinging upon the individual. The state would fund social welfare not with the products of labor, but with the value of land that had been created by the development of the whole community. This cartoon was printed in Puck during George's 1886 mayoral campaign. It depicts a blacksmith being tempted by the devil to join George's cause. George is standing on top of Jay Gould, who had monopolized the nation's telegraph system and many of its railroads as well. In the image, the devil projects to the blacksmith. George is showering the worker with his, quote, horn of promises. While satirical, the cartoon tells us a lot about George's appeal. First, his audience is depicted as a blacksmith, part of the independent artisan class, who is likely coded as an immigrant. George's promises include no taxes, free land, free beer, no rent, no police, and free cigars. The way this cartoon depicts George seems, in a lot of ways, remarkably modern. It echoes contemporary conservative critiques of free college or free healthcare. But this cartoon also associates George with the idea of limiting the power of government. At a time when laws around the country mandated Sabbath closings on Sundays and prohibited alcohol, George was seen as a critic of this sort of moral legislation, of alcohol prohibition of vices, and North tried to establish a free labor system and universal manhood suffrage in the South. However, calls by newly emancipated freed people for the redistribution of land and for taxes to fund public services led many formal liberals to reevaluate their faith in democracy. Here you see depictions of a predominantly black legislature during the Reconstruction South. This is meant to offend the sensibilities of an American audience that a black man is, sitting in the halls of the legislature, that he's receiving, he's having his shoes shined by a white man. The magazine The Nation, for example, endorsed Southern intimidation of Black voters, and as white workers began to organize into unions, also engaged in a campaign to limit the right of citizens without property to vote. At the same time, the British philosopher Herbert Spencer helped transition liberal capitalism away from its connection to democracy and equal rights. Um, Spencer had anticipated Charles Darwin's idea of natural selection and coined the term survival of the fittest to embody the idea that competition would weed out the weak. Spencer exploded the idea that, quote, all men are created equal by arguing that civilizational progress was the result of biological evolution and that most peoples in the world lacked the capacity for complex society. Freedom, Spencer argued, was only possible for those who had evolved enough to regulate themselves. Slavery, feudalism, and other types of oppression were natural and progressive ways to weed out those who had not evolved enough to be part of a civilized society. Although Spencer supported land value taxation, George attacked him frequently in his writings for these views. In fact, George's emphasis on the rise and fall of civilizations and progress and poverty should largely be seen as an argument that social progress is a product of social equality, not, as Spencer argued, biological improvement. As George entered the public stage, the first stirring of a new type of academic progressivism was also emerging. In 1885, the American Economics Association was founded. Its first president was Francis Walker. Walker had published a book of criticism of George entitled Land and Its Rents. Many academics criticize the very idea that a citizen without a doctorate in economics should be able to shape economic thought. E.R.A. Seligman, for example, noted that, quote, in biology, in astronomy, in metaphysics, we bow down before the specialist. A man whose knowledge of economics or the science of finance is derived from the daily papers or one or two books with lopsided ideas, he is a full-fledged scientist. The differences in economic doctrine between George and progressive academics were, in many respects, small compared to their broader disputes over democracy versus government by experts. At the time, Germany had pioneered the modern university system of academic training. Many newly minted academics studied for a time in Germany, which, with its new powerful central state, was experiencing a period of rapid industrial economic growth, similar to that of China today. Progressive economists like Richard Ely marveled at how in Germany academics had enormous influence over public policy, whereas the working class was often effectively disenfranchised. Many academics were drawn to a metaphysical belief prevalent in the German academy that nations were not collections of individuals, but a single corporate organism that could best realize its destiny under a strong, unified leadership. Germany had already begun on the road towards fascism. Japan, which would look to Germany as its model, would of course follow a parallel path. But at the time, Germany seemed like a model. And progressive academics sought to export it to the United States, which they saw as encumbered by outmoded ideas of individual rights and popular sovereignty. This, by the way, is a picture from a meeting of the American Economics Association in which eugenics was being discussed. This then was a period when many different currents of thought converged on critiques of democratic equality. Progressives and social Darwinists both embraced the idea that government should be more active in ensuring that the quote race evolved in a positive direction. Most states, as you can see on this map, all except for the ones colored in white, established some sort of forced sterilization law. Often these laws gave so-called health experts wide latitude to determine who might be unfit, usually disabled, poor, and members of minority communities. Eugenics classes were amongst the most popular offerings on college campuses. Herbert Crowley argued that government should be to, quote, improve the means whereby men and women are bred. Crowley was the progressive editor of the New Republic, and his calls for a politics based on the idea of nationalism embraced Theodore Roosevelt in his 1912 presidential campaign, in which the new nationalism was the slogan. This was also a period during which the United States began to embrace imperialism, establishing its first overseas colonies after the Spanish American War in 1898. At the time, there was no precedent or clear constitutional rationale for making places like Puerto Rico and Guam territories of the United States without any sort of representation in the federal system. Sorry, just checking the comments I saw. We'll do question and answer. If anyone has any immediate comments, they can feel free to interrupt. But otherwise, we can talk about things afterwards. Uh, although there was no established rationale for imperialism or for incorporating colonies into the United States, most Americans now regarded these new possessions as peopled with inferior races incapable of self-government. Theodore Roosevelt rejected calls to grant the Philippines their independence, noting that he has no time for those who, quote, cant about liberty and consent of the governed. The progressives argued that imperialism was a natural extension of the progressive doctrine of expert management. Giddings identified anarchists and George as the leading holdouts to this principle of, quote, deference to natural leadership. Before progressives emerged on the scene, the South had already begun to pivot away from democracy through the violent oppression of Black voters. Norms of separation between whites and blacks were common, though after segregation was ruled constitutional in the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson case, progressives often played lead roles in establishing increasingly stringent Jim Crow laws. Here you see a map of, graph of years during which Jim Crow laws were established in North Carolina. Ends with the Civil War period when such laws were not being established with much frequency. But then it begins to pick up quite precipitously in the 1880s to the first few years of the 20th century. Saw segregation as a natural extension of their vision of a tightly organized society built on biological hierarchies. Walker, who was president of the American Economic Association and one of George's fiercest critics in the Academy, even predicted would go extinct because of the principle of survival of the fittest. Middle class native born Americans would also work to bring the strategies of Black disenfranchisement to the North to target urban working class immigrant communities. During this period, as you can see, voter participation begins to drop precipitously in the 1880s. Um, and this was largely due to laws meant to make it more difficult for urban immigrants to register. Often, urbanites had to register in person during the work week, and then their registration would be invalidated when an official came to the house and didn't find anyone present, also during the work week when they were usually otherwise occupied. Requirements that voters be resident of a particular precinct for years before registering also effectively disenfranchised many working class ethnics who often had to travel frequently in search of new jobs. In contrast to these trends, George and his supporters would find their most consistent base of support in these sorts of working class ethnic communities. George himself railed against the corruption of immigrant run political machines like Tammany Hall. But the reason why they're so antagonistic in the campaign of 1886 is precisely that they drew on the same voters. Theodore Roosevelt, as the Republican candidate, was simply not part of the discussion because his criticisms of the morality of working class immigrants appealed to a totally different subset of New York. Tammany Hall provided immigrants with jobs, beer, clam bakes, and Thanksgiving turkeys in return for voting the Democratic Party ticket. Paid for this incipient welfare state by skimming off the top of illegal gambling dens and brothels, and by shaking down businesses. George shared with Tammany Hall a desire to help the poor and break down moral legislation. When Tammany made efforts to clean up its act in the early 20th century, many Georges cooperated with them, even if they sometimes were at arm's length. Even Samuel Seabury, who eventually took down Tammany, once actively sought their endorsement in his run for governor. But whereas Tammany treated welfare as a privilege taken from crime and reserved for political supporters, George saw it as a right derived from the share of the community the share that the community had in its own urban. George was part of the same current of immigrant politics as Tammany, worked to liberalize its institutions by making them rights administered by an impartial government rather than tools of partisan corruption. I'll check this comment. Okay. Um, Georgia's single tax was also adeptly designed to preserve the egalitarian impulses of abolition. Those who had fought for an end to slavery often imagined that once workers were free to find their own bosses, equality and prosperity would follow. Instead, the years after the Civil War witnessed a period of growing inequality. Many abolitionists became disillusioned and blamed the shortcomings of capitalism on the poor themselves, adopting the hierarchical, racialized logic that pervaded the times. And of course, picture you see an image articulating these aspirations, contrasting the horrors of slavery on the outside to a future after emancipation of um, middle class black families living lives of relative affluence. George brought former abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison II back into the cause of reform by convincing them that equality was possible under the terms that abolitionists had promised. Most of the monopolies that ran small business out of operation railroad, telegraph, steel, were rooted in the exclusive ownership of natural resources or rights of way, which George promised to abolish. Taxes on these monopolies split them up, creating competition. These taxes would also fund social welfare and education, fostering equality of producers to keep what they had made, because land was a gift of God, not a product of nature. This was a system of social welfare consistent with abolitionist beliefs in free labor and free competition. Returning the United States to a condition of relative equality would fix democratic institutions that had fallen into decline. Economic, urban, and developments that had fed the rising cost of land would, and therefore had created inequality, would instead benefit all. The dream of progress would finally be real, and mankind could expect a progressively rosier future. This vision would inspire activists across the country to fight for reforms that ran counter to the reactionary trends of their time. Georgist, for example, established the most important reforms towards democracy during the period. George argued that through a fair vote, he would have won his mayoral campaign in 1886, and upon his defeat, formed an organization to promote the adoption of the secret ballot. At this point, voters received a pre-filled ballot from a party official standing outside of the polls. It was common for polling stations to become sites of mass violence, as depicted here. Um, as rioters tried to run off voters from the other party, or expel the party officials, ensuring that there would be no ballots from the other party there. It was not unheard of for rioters to run off with all of the ballots from a particular polling station either. 2 years after George's 1886 campaign, when Louisville, Kentucky became the first city in the nation to establish a secret ballot in which these sorts of intimidation would no longer be possible, the bill's author cited George as his inspiration. In states and cities across the country, Georgists were responsible for drafting the bills that established the secret ballot. Within a few years, the system had become standard across the country. Georgists would also play a pivotal role in another democratic reform, direct taxation. The same year that the secret ballot was first established, James Sullivan, editor of George's Standard, um, the publication George had founded to promote his ideas, Sullivan visited Switzerland to study their system of direct democracy. In 1892, he published a book introducing the American public to the idea of referendums and initiatives in which voters would register their support or disapproval of specific um, proposals. 4 years later, William Uren was elected to the Oregon state legislature. Uren noted that the single tax had been hard to establish so far, but reasoned that if voters could bypass the interests that dominated legislatures and vote directly on the issue, it would be more attainable. Through some wheeling and dealing, Uren was able in 1902 to get Oregon to establish the referendum. Oregon's legislation became a model for the nation, and Uren was named the father of direct legislation. The Fellows Fund Commission paid for Uren to become a full-time activist, promoting the cause of legislation. This included paying for him to meet then governor of New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson, whom he won over to the cause of direct legislation. Just would also resist the racialized thinking of their time. In Progress and Poverty, George had rejected interpretations of history built on race, noting that, quote, we of modern civilization are raised far above. What is because we stand on a pyramid, not that we are taller. What the centuries have done for us is not to increase our stature, but to build up a structure on which we can plant our feet. Consequently, the great liberal attorney Clarence Darrow remembered that George came from a poor family and surmised that if eugenicists, quote, could have a political convention to determine the fathers and mothers of the human race, that it's pretty sure that few of the great would be born. Clarence Darrow and Louis Post, who edited the leading single tax journal of the early 20th century, The Public, were both founding members of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. As Assistant Secretary of Labor during one, Post threatened to deny federal war contracts to businesses that discriminated on the basis of race. It's hard to assess how effective this policy was, but it's potentially a huge lever for the development of the civil rights movement, which would rely upon the opening up of industrial jobs in the North so that Black people could migrate to the North where they would have the right and could influence Democratic Party policy. Similarly, Newton Baker lobbied for the Carnegie Corporation to fund a major study of the race problem. This study became Gutter Murdahl's An American Dilemma, one of the foundational texts of the civil rights movement. In the 1920s, Newton Baker was also the leading proponent of the League of Nations and independence for colonized peoples. Baker got his start out as the lieutenant of Tom Johnson, whose campaigns for urban land value taxation and municipal ownership of utilities became the template for the movement after George's death. Beginning in 1901, Johnson fought a very public battle for the establishment of 3-cent streetcar fare and land value taxation in Cleveland. He was seen as the nation's most prominent radical mayor and was branded the best mayor of the best governed city in the United States. During his 8 years in office, he paved as many roads as had been paved in the entire history of Cleveland up to that point. Other cities around the nation imitated his policies and often communicated regularly with members of his administration about how to follow the precedents he set. Johnson helped turn the once Republican leaning swing state of Ohio into a Democratic leaning swing state. And Woodrow Wilson would recruit many of Johnson's associates into his administration to secure victory in Ohio. Single tax officials pushed the Wilson administration toward Georgism in some important ways. Perhaps most notably, they passed the first laws for the leasing of public land, setting the precedent in which natural resources are no longer given away, but instead out to private businesses, with the government remaining owner in perpetuity. They also passed the Water Power Act, established public rights to water power sites. Or they fought against an extension of the income tax to the average citizen and instead established a tax regime that soaked the wealth and businesses with extraordinary rates of return, which they perceived as rooted in monopoly. Republicans had argued for the World War I as a frankly imperialistic adventure with hopes of establishing a great power alliance with England and France to dominate the post-war world. However, as head of Wilson's propaganda agency, the George Krill blamed the war on Germany's autocratic government of feudal elites and called for a post-war settlement that would establish national self-determination supported by the League of Nations. Krill distributed pamphlets favoring national independence around the world, provoking a wave of anti-colonial agitation. Now, collectively, these policies look a lot more like modern liberalism than many of the contemporary ideologies like progressivism. Though that's not necessarily always because Georgists were directly responsible for popularizing these ideas. Also, important examples where these survived because they just worked better. When Franklin Roosevelt became president in 1932, he had a deep interest in social rights to land and natural resources, which was likely influenced by the Georgist milieu in which he worked when he was coming up through New York state politics. But he was in no sense a doctrinaire Georgist. Mostly, he was a Democrat who believed in following the popular will. Most members of his administration assumed their key accomplishment would be the development of an economy planned by government experts according to the ideas of progressive economists. But this plan, embodied in the National Recovery Administration, just failed. Um, at the same time, Roosevelt followed up on plans for government owned hydroelectric power that had been laid by Tom Johnson's lieutenant, Newton Baker. This Tennessee Valley Authority offered electricity to people who lacked it, expanding consumption without any of the adverse effects of regulating business that the NRA had. Roosevelt engaged in vigorous experimentation without any strict guidelines. But those experiments ended with a system that disproportionately treated land and natural resources as social property because those policies were simply more successful. Ultimately, I contend that Georgism was not the product of one man, but a broader social phenomenon whose time had come. When George wrote, there were already a growing number of voices calling for land value taxation as the free soil of the West disappeared. Alfred Russel Wallace famously discovered the idea of biological evolution at the same time as Charles Darwin, was writing his own book on land nationalization when George published Progress and Poverty. In other words, without George, someone else would likely have taken his place. The only question is whether that person could have as effectively inspired people to fight for democracy as George had. The world in which we currently reside is always uncomfortably like the one in George. Efforts to deal with high urban land values by encouraging suburbanization have run up against the natural limits of outward expansion from cities, even as the efficiencies of urban economies have become more obvious. The result is rising urban land values that seem to make people poorer despite clear signs of economic progress. As depicted, and as you can see in these graphs, growth in GDP versus trade openness, free trade has created substantial economic development, but the land remains, as Bush called it, quote, the robber that takes all that is left. New consumers and economies have lifted demand for, and therefore the price of, basic natural resources like steel and oil. As a result, the percentage of the world economy absorbed by natural resource rents has increased by more than fivefold since the 1970s. In England, land values have risen from one-fifth of national wealth to over one-half of all national wealth in 2018. Politically, this situation is also disturbingly similar. Across the world, faith in democracy, as you see depicted here, has declined rapidly. Liberalism and individualism have become taboo subjects in some corners. China and Russia have helped popularize the idea that authoritarian nationalism can be a viable system, even though, like Germany before them, they've only grown more dangerous with time. The India China Institute at the New School, for example, points to China as evidence of a post liberal future. Because of substantial financial entanglements between China and US universities, speakers have seen their engagements on college campuses canceled when they spoke out against ongoing acts of genocide in China. Most scholars who study China report engaging in self-censorship to maintain access. Also, throughout the world, the social democratic welfare states that had helped stabilize democracy have increasingly struggled to mitigate inequality. To those who hope to revitalize those systems, these changes are the results of supernaturally influential conservative economists. Personally, I doubt that Milton Friedman single handedly won over the world. Authors of New Deal policies like Rex Tugwell and Raymond Moley readily acknowledged that many of these policies would only work in self contained national economies without foreign competition. But tariff systems became increasingly impractical as products became more complicated and dependent upon globally sourced resources like rare earth minerals. For example, in the 1970s, when Japanese steel producers were running US steel mills out of business, the federal government responded with import controls. But the result was that now US automakers had to use high priced American steel, making them uncompetitive too. Thus, protectionism only spread the crisis throughout US industry. The New Deal had also occurred at a time when new automotive transportation and economic depression had driven land values to historic lows. Policies, if established, were therefore intended to increase the value of assets like land. Now, however, we are in an economy where housing prices are a major axis of inequality and a drag on producers who have to pay more for offices and labor. New Deal policies meant to increase housing prices have not only ceased to be helpful, but instead are downright counterproductive. So I think we should conclude by reconsidering the Seabury quote that we began with. It is easy to dismiss the history of George's movements as a failure because we don't live in a world governed by the single tax. But Seabury saw that these movements had contributed to saving democracy during a period when it was in crisis. They inspired people to fight for democracy and establish reforms that, although they came short of the single tax, helped shore up faith in liberal democracy. George's ideas are more relevant today than when he wrote. The crises that he warned against are often more imminent. It is more imperative today that we recognize nature as a shared resource rather than a private possession to be exploited at will. It is more important that we establish healthy cities and transit to end the suburban sprawl that has destroyed much of the planet. The social democratic alternative that helped shore up 20th century democracy is struggling in a competitive globalized economy. We need people fighting to build new economic and political institutions rather than allowing our current institutions to contribute to continue the drift into decline. All right, so I'll open it up from there. Questions? Marty?
Yeah, I thought it was a good intro, and I guess what I would like to say is I began reading your book, and I found that after reading a lot of books that cover the same period, I thought you got into some more interesting depth regarding his time in California and such. But I wanted to ask a question about the period at the beginning when you were talking about Reconstruction. The audio was off for about 20 seconds, and I want to make sure that you kind of made the same point that you thought you were making, so that people watching the recording might think that it was censored or something.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, I did see a notice that my internet connection was unstable. I didn't realize I had lost you. Yeah, so George was coming of age in a lot of ways politically. He was beginning as a political writer during this period after the Civil War, in which the North was working to create a more egalitarian society in the South, including shoring up free labor, the right to vote for Black. This was a period during which, for some moments, you had Black representation in legislature. And there was also a backlash to the moment throughout not just the South, but also much of the country. The Southern whites worked to violently suppress the right to vote for African Americans. And for, about 10 years, the North tried to halt this and to establish a more egalitarian society despite Southern resistance. But eventually the North stopped trying, and people who had been associated with liberal ideas abandoned um, uh, in popular democracy. And there are a lot of reasons for this. There's been a lot written on the fall of Reconstruction. So I don't want to oversimplify it, but one of the important elements of this, liberals believed in a market economy. They believed in private property, and in the South, black voters were taxing land heavily to form public education systems that hadn't existed, to form new public services like universities and asylums. And Northern liberals saw these policies as anti-property, and they believed that maybe universal suffrage was not a good thing, that maybe certain people should be intimidated away from the ballot box. And this coincided with a panic in the Northern economy, in which you saw a rise of labor unions. And so Northern liberals began to sympathize in a lot of ways with Southern who believed that universal suffrage was incompatible with capitalism. And so this is one of those sort of trends against which George, I contend, is fighting. Or another one of those away from democracy that gives context to some of the concerns you see in uh, of democratic society. Does that
Okay.
answer your question?
Yeah, I thought that was a good little overview. That was missing in the first go round. So thanks.
Oh, thank you. Giannis?
Yes, thank you, thank you, Christopher. I have a few questions, but I have one about the period when you talk about Mayor Johnson,
Mm-hmm.
and you said in 1901, Mayor Johnson was instrumental, and George was instrumental in shifting Ohio from Republicans to Democrats. Now, and I'm asking for you to elaborate a little bit more. Why was that a good thing? And in other words, what were the differences in policies between the Republican and the Democratic Party at that time in Ohio? And the reason I'm saying that is because you exalted Georgia's anti-racist, but the Democratic Party was the Jim Crow party, and it is until this day. But today they practice racism, but they preach anti-racism. At that time, they were both racist practitioners and racist orators. So I'm trying to understand how did that comment fit in that historical context of 1901 in Ohio. Thank
you. Yeah. So um, it is true that the Democratic Party in the South is the party of racial reaction. And Lewis Post, who is the public and is in a lot of ways the intellectual leader of early 20th century Georgism, often draws a sharp line between, Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats, and, frequently campaigns against Southern Democrats because of this association. It is a complicated subject. Uh, I think Lewis Post recognized clearly and identified that he was making compromises here that he didn't necessarily want to make. But at the same time, the Republican Party had also largely ceased to be the party of racial equality. The main sort of turning point here that a lot of people identify is the Spanish-American War, because this is when a Republican president, McKinley, decides to annex Puerto Rico and Guam, and you know the effort to justify the idea that these places should be absorbed in state without giving them to vote. And so at this point, there's a sense that there's a convergence on the question of race between Democrats and Republicans, because the Republican Party largely steps aside from any idea of racial equality. Uh, Theodore Roosevelt, he's very complicated views on race that I don't think I could get into here. But in 1912, he makes a similar compromise at the Progressive Party convention, in which he agrees with the Lillites to exclude Black voters from the Progressive Party convention. So, I think there's definitely, um, you know, there were reactionary elements in the Democratic Party, but I don't think racial progressives could really pick a party with any confidence that would represent progress.
But
W.B. Du
but
Bois,
but
the founder.
In Ohio, what was the difference? Like, why was that important to favor for George to favor the Democratic Party at the time versus the Republican? And probably, as you say, probably race was not the arbiter. And but what was it?
So the reason why why Georgia's rallied largely to the Democratic Party is it's the party of free, and that is an important part of the Georgia's platform. And Georgia see it as a precursor to the single tax, because most revenue comes from tariffs, and so if you cut tariffs, this raises the whole question of taxation. And so that's really the reason why Georgia's sort of the Democratic Party, for the purposes of this particular story. The real reason why this is important is because in shifting party identification, they become valuable assets to Woodrow Wilson, and that's why they obtain a place in his administration. But you know of that the moral balance of these parties is um, you know not in either case. Edward.
I have a different question, but kind of to add to what you've been talking with Giannis, would it be fair to say that the popularity of Tom L. Johnson was also instrumental, just as the popularity of him as an individual political figure, a reform mayor, in getting people to support the Democratic Party generally in Ohio?
Yeah. So the reason why I attribute the Ohio Georgia as being important to the election of 1912 is that if you look at the change of party identification between 1908 and 1912, the shift in voter affiliation in Cleveland and Toledo by themselves constitute the balance. Those two cities are the places that change the party affiliation of the state. And that's Cleveland, which under Johnson and then Newton Baker is under the leadership of Georges Maris, and also Toledo, which under um, um, uh, Brand Whitlock is also under a Georges mayor. So there's a sense that these administrations have presided over a shift in partisan affiliation. In some cases, because of their personal popularity. Also, it's because they have whole cadre of people around them who are expert propagandists who are leading the national narrative in a lot of ways, including Lincoln Steffens, who is influential in taking down the Republican Party in Ohio, and is kind of a leading muckraker in the nation. Brand's Tom Johnson the best mayor of the best governed city in the United.
Well, let me get on to the one issue that I wanted you to comment on, and that is I just finished this series of lectures on the efforts by single taxers in Georgia to establish an independent political movement. And they did not succeed despite their best efforts. We've had the same problem with any independent third party movement trying to take on the oligopoly of the Democrats and Republicans. Probably the most recent partial success was the Reform Party under Ross Perot. So my question to you is, do you think it was a mistake for the single taxers to pursue that effort? Did they accomplish anything meaningful by doing so? And would they possibly have done better by infiltrating the Democrats and Republicans more thoroughly?
Yeah. So, it's a famous, conundrum of American politics. They even have a labor party. Most countries have a party based on organized labor. The United States has never really had that, aside from some briefly lived third party movements. So, America is a country that has not really supported much in the third way in independent politics. And George makes concerted effort, I argue, to get Georgists into the Democratic Party of influence. And in a lot of ways, they do. They make it into the Wilson administration. They play politics adeptly well, um, and they manage to secure some accomplishments. But the counter argument is that, and I think we've alluded to this, that in getting involved in major party politics, you're always going to get your hands dirty.
Compromise your
In a lot of
principles.
ways, yeah, in a ways, their association, for example, with Woodrow Wilson and the shortcomings of World War I and the post-war settlement are something that stained them in the aftermath of Wilson's administration. So that's a bargain you have to. It's a bargain, and you have to decide whether or not you're going to take it. Right. Wayne?
Oh, yes. Some things here. You mentioned about Ohio turning down Democratic, but it's my understanding that I've read this lots of times that no Republican ever won the presidency without without winning Ohio, and therefore the Republicans won the presidency in 1900, 1904, and 1908. So they had to have carried Ohio all 3 years. I think that. Also, the Republican Party actually kind of lost its kind of purity a long time before McKinley, when they agreed to 1876 to incoming President Hayes agreed not to no longer basically use the federal army to enforce civil rights laws in the South, and that is how they got the agreement to put Hayes into the presidency, when Samuel Tilden probably legitimately won that election. Okay, that's it for the time being. Thank you.
Yeah, the compromise in 1876 is obviously a huge moment in Republican Party stepping away from the politics of Reconstruction. It's normally considered the end of Reconstruction. They do sell out Black constituents, but there is also a way in which the Republican Party remains very much kind of the party of Black voters and fights for civil rights in limited ways, and that never totally goes away. It comes back again in the 1920s when Harding supports Black rights. It's still in the 1930s a vital contest between which is better for Black voters, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. So it is something that comes in waves. In terms of party affiliation, Democrats and in Ohio in a year. It was a process. Johnson ran for governor in 1904 and lost. Um, but Georgia's due process, it's instrumental in putting Democrats in charge of Ohio for the first time. This is actually Frederick Howe, who is famous Georgist, one of Johnson's close associates, who is involved in the state assembly. He manages to uncover a scandal about Republican treasurers, keeping state money in private banks, or not disclosing where it is, not handing over the money on time. And around the same time, Lincoln Steffens writes a famous story about Ohio politics, The Tale of Two Cities, which he talks about Ohio, a state that, in Cleveland is run immaculately, and in Republican Cincinnati is full of corruption. And this does lead to a change in the state house, the election of a Democratic governor, a series of reforms modeled on Tom Johnson's original platform in 1904. So this is a process that comes to fruition after a long period of contact. Ed?
I have one final question for you. What is your current topic of research, and when can we expect a follow-up to your most recent book?
I don't know. I have I don't have any sort of research support really. I would be interested in maybe publishing, getting Lewis Post autobiography published with an introduction of Georgism and ideas of the public sphere. But really, I don't have any plans right now.
Well, I hope they could become more concrete, and I've done everything I can to let people know that your book is a wonderful read, with, as Wayne indicated, a lot, and Marty indicated, a lot of details in there that your research has uncovered, that I have to say were not generally available to those of us who rely on the archive of the Georgist movement. So you've given me a lot of work to do to follow up on your research on some of these individuals who were involved, who played prominent roles that were heretofore unknown to me.
I spent a lot of time at the Library of Congress looking through private manuscript collections, and those are, they're volume, they're very large, they're hard to wade through, but in after time, it gave me a sense of the connections within the movement, and it's a movement without a lot of organization. It doesn't really believe in organization, but those private networks were a way to suss out who was related to whom and what they were accomplishing, which was I think more than was otherwise evident.
Well, we owe you a vote of thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Any other questions or comment before we, okay, Marty.
Yeah, thanks. Giving me opportunity. So in the book, you kind of went out of the way to show that you're not a Georgist per se, and you're not pushing it, so to speak. But did you do that just to show that you had some independent thought and independent credentials? Was that the purpose for doing that? And are you interested in advancing the Georgist cause?
A good bit of this book is about critiquing alternative currents during the period that are based off of academia and experts sort of imposing their ideas on others. I believe expertise is most useful when it is independent and tries to be as broadly critical and skeptical as possible. And so I try to model what I think is, a better and more appropriate uh, method of academic discourse, which tries to not be explicitly aligned, but to try to um, to try to you know suss out ideas and sort of um, be independent, to take really kind of critical ethos as its a model of objectivity. I think objectivity is really possible, in a strictest sense, but I think the best we can do is to make sure that we try to hold everyone up to criticism and observation.
So that's the position that you're going to take post writing the book and into the near future?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Giannis?
I don't know. I missed the first part of the talk, so I'll have to rely on the recording to revisit. So I don't know if you touched this issue. One main point of Henry George and what separates Henry George and the Georgist movement from other so-called land movements is that land redistribution or agrarian reform, as it has been practiced in many different, time periods in history and geographical localities, and doesn't work. It's not about land redistribution like the 40 acres and a mule. That would have never worked. Okay, and it has never worked anywhere. And it hasn't worked actually for white farmers, like privileged farmers. You see, in the end, they got decimated, okay, by big banks, by big agricultural farms. It's so. I think that should be an angle. I don't know if you follow that angle in the book. That if you don't protect the productive classes from rent seeking, they are going to be led to enslavement no matter what privileged initial conditions you start with. And we see that today is more manifest than ever. When the decimation of the working class and of the middle class is colorblind. So I think focusing on the Reconstruction period and on the race angle of social inequality and economic injustice is flawed and counterproductive. But it's an excellent entry point to elucidate and bring up the Georgist message of protection of the working classes from rent extractivism. Do you have any comment on that?
I talk about the relationship between Georgism and what had been the Free Soil movement before, which was, a movement in American politics to granting everyone free access to 160 acres of land. And I do talk about how Georgism in some ways emerged out of the failure of that, because land was no longer primarily agricultural in its use. 160 acres in Manhattan is a lot different than 160 acres in Iowa, right? This is not really a practical policy. And in terms of the implementation of the Homestead Act, most homesteaders didn't make it because what you needed close access to a railway. and that land was partitioned and sold off. And so the idea that land is, equivalent, that the value of land is primarily agricultural, rather than about sort of location, was just not really practical. And that is the foundation of a lot of kind of agrarian ideas. But I point to the fact that Georgism was primarily a shift away from agrarian ideas of land to an increasingly sophisticated awareness of the ways in which land has important communication and commercial purposes that are far more valuable than the agrarian uses of land.
Thank you.
Rick.
Yes, Christopher, thank you. Very good talk. I was wondering if in your studies of Louis Post, if you had any opinion about when the 16th Amendment was being ratified, he tries to get the national movement going again. He's trying to restore the 1890 platform that when George launched the national movement. Do you have any opinion about that era of his efforts in that regard?
Could what about him doing in particular?
Well, what was he trying to restore the national movement, and was he getting resistance from various sources? I don't know if you came across that.
Yeah, so I think Post is pretty optimistic about the movement at the time. He talks quite openly about how people who are aware of and believe in Georgist ideas are sparkled throughout positions of power um, during this period, and they're working to implement ideas based off of Georgism. He talks a bit about the ways in which the movement's efforts at organization have not been that effective. And so there's been a transition towards kind of this focus on individual political entrepreneurs, people of great ability at shaping discourse and winning elections. This includes William U'Ren and Tom Johnson. There are a lot of shortcomings to this method, as would become obvious later when you don't really have an institution that you can pass along to another generation. But it was quite effective for a while. Even the Fells Fund Commission, which was a major organization with a lot of money, really what it did was it just loaned or gave money to individuals, and it had an explicit policy of not giving money to groups. It wanted to only give money to exceptional individuals who were creating change in the country. This comes out of what comes out of the fact that Georgists, as I sort of allude to, have a pretty individualistic disposition. They believe in a balance between the communal, the social, and the individual, but they do, assign individuals a high place, and they're not necessarily eager to put individuals at the behest of organizations. There's also a sense that the single tax conferences of the 1890s had produced kind of policies that were inconsistent with George's ideas in many cases, and George broke with them, and was not happy to kind of submit himself to any sort of group of people convening to tell him what he was supposed to believe. So the sense was that this movement was seceding, but it was seceding as a movement of individuals rather than organizations. That has made the movement harder to track in posterity. It's made it much more elusive, but it was not, I think, an ineffective way of establishing change. Marty?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Phelps because that was my question. Probably the most intriguing line or page in the book was the meeting of Fells with Lenin in England. I don't know if it was 1914 or something, but you mentioned that Fells handed Lenin a pamphlet that was Georgist, or was it received well? Was there anything ever a result of that comment, or what exactly
No,
was that about?
no, Lennon brushed it off, and I think saw it as a bit of a joke that a businessman had loaned him money. Was very clearly awkward about it, because he believed in a very theoretical framework in which there were clear divisions. It couldn't really account for clear class division. They couldn't really account for why Fells was there supporting him. Um, Interestingly, though, they eventually get paid back. Well, Fells' widow was paid back after the Russian Revolution. Made a point to, I don't mention this in the book, but they do make a point um, to repay the loan as a honestly, I don't know. But at that point, it wasn't much appreciated because, the Fellows family had thought that the Bolsheviks were fighting against Russian feudalism, not that they were going to, you know, establish what became the Soviet Union.
Mhm. So, what was the pamphlet that Fells gave Lenin? Was there something that's recognizable, or
That's a good question. I'm not sure if I encountered that detail. If I did,
okay,
I don't remember.
no problem. I just thought it was kind of interesting. Thanks.
Michael? Michael
Michael,
B.
you are muted.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you that, thank you very much for that information. I found a lot of it kind of new and interesting. And then also the period that you were talking about in your lecture, do you think it was more inclined towards decentralization than centralization? Like there were lots of these issues that we see now. It's more on a centralized national basis than it was back at that time, where you saw like the governor of Ohio, sort of led a platform that went from Republican to Democratic, and then it was a time of a changing social values. So was it more inclined towards decentralization or more in centralization, the developments?
Yeah. So, one of the major divisions between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party during the period is that the Republican Party is the party of centralization. And, it's not just centralization of government. Theodore Roosevelt's platform is you're going to have a very big government that'll be there to make sure that very big businesses, which are the way of the future, will be well regulated and will act in the public interest. The Democratic Party generally tends to be the party of small producers. Woodrow Wilson argues for a new freedom. The government will have a less consistent intervention in economic affairs. It will establish a few major systematic reforms that will redistribute wealth to make things a little bit less centralized. Here, he's thinking of free trade. He's thinking of the Fed. He's thinking of uh, the income tax. And so this is obviously a platform that is much more consistent with Georgism. Georgism is leaning towards decentralization, believes that the government will grow, but also wants to make sure that the role of the government is tightly circumscribed, that there are limits, that the government will expand in proportion to this communal wealth in land, product of the growth of cities, and social demand for finite resources. So, Georgians hope to split up monopolies with taxes. They hope to, expand government, but only in, in positive ways. George talked about stripping down the ability of government to punish people. He talks about in a future state where poverty is abolished, towards, we'll move towards a society in which government will have to punish people progressively less. And so, Georgism is part of this decentralization movement towards decentralization in the face of an otherwise centralizing society. In that it's aligned with the Democratic Party and finds itself at odds with Republicans, Theodore Roosevelt.